So, Mayor's announcements. As members will be aware, our colleague and friend, Councillor John Hills, sadly passed away on the 24th of April this year. John was first elected to the council for New Eltham Ward in 2000, and then subsequently re-elected in 6 consecutive elections, most recently to represent the New Mottingham, Colharbour and New Eltham Ward in 2022. He served on numerous committees and panels, most recently Highways Committee, Woolwich and Thamesmead Area Planning Committee, and Corporate Finance and Performance Scrutiny Panel. Over the course of his long service to the community, Councillor Hills served as a school governor, as chair of the Community Association of New Eltham, and as an honorary president of the Greenwich Conservative Federation. A former member of the Armed Forces, Councillor Hills served as the Borough's Armed Forces representative. With 24 years of continuous service on the council, he was one of the most experienced ward councillors in the borough. His service included periods as opposition group whip and opposition spokesperson for health and adult social care, a subject he was passionate about. He will be sadly missed, and I would like to send our thoughts and condolences to his family. Can I ask the leader of the opposition to say a few words?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a difficult speech to give, so if you could perhaps bear with me. Yesterday we said farewell to John at an incredibly moving service in the North Chapel at Eltham Crematorium. It was standing room only, and there was not a dry eye in the house. I know that the turnout was greatly appreciated by Pat and the rest of John's family, who are in all of our thoughts and prayers. John was utterly devoted to Pat, to their children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they'll all be watching the video of this evening's tributes, Mr. Mayor, as well. Because tonight we all have the chance to focus on John's incredible record of public service, as you said, in our borough. John was a councillor for 24 years. He won 7 consecutive elections in the same area. And I've checked the history books, Mr. Mayor, and I can only find one other Conservative councillor who won more consecutive elections, Peter King, who won 8. And by my reckoning, that makes John one of the most successful council candidates in the history of Greenwich Borough. And in the nicest possible way, you wouldn't necessarily think it. And you wouldn't think it for 2 reasons. The first reason is that John was not a politician. He wasn't that interested in party politics. John was a community man. He was a community leader. He was for the residents, always, and he never let politics get in the way. And lots of us have said, haven't we, in these last few weeks, how John transcended party politics, and it's true, he did. But make no mistake, John was a Tory, to his fingertips. He was a working-class Tory by instinct and by the values that he lived by, that we heard articulated so powerfully at the funeral yesterday. And as you said, and as many people perhaps didn't realise, he served as president of the Greenwich Conservative Party for 15 years. He was an absolutely central figure in our local party. And in our office on Westmount Road, there will soon hang John's portrait alongside Dermot Poston and Peter King as the giants of Greenwich Conservatives that they were. And he was a big figure in my life, someone I looked up to. It was John who taught me how to be a councillor. Not this part, in the council chamber, with our debates and our motions and our politics and our occasional showboating, Mr. Mayor. I learned all that from Spencer Drury. But it was John Hills who taught me how to be a ward councillor, how to do that important, sometimes invisible job out in the community, which John did so well. I first got to know John 12 years ago when I was selected as a candidate for Colharbour and New Eltham Ward to stand alongside John and Mandy Brinkhurst. We were a great team, as John, Roger, Tester and I were later as well, and as, in a different way, Cathy Dowes, John and I have been for these last 2 years too. And whoever was in the team, it was always very much John's team. And I soon discovered back then in 2014 that John had a unique canvassing style. John was one of the most over-optimistic canvassers I have ever campaigned with. He would knock on the door would open. He'd thrust a leaflet towards the unsuspecting constituent, who was no doubt wondering what on earth this was all about on a Saturday morning. And John's opening gambit was the same every single time. Hello, I'm John Hills. I've been your councillor 14 years. Can I have your vote? A short conversation would then ensue, and afterwards John would come bounding up the road to the person running the board, bounding, Mr. Mayor, well into his late 70s, with his thumb in the air, and he'd say the same thing every time: they're ours. It didn't seem to matter what was said in this conversation. They could be a dyed-in-the-wool Conservative voter with 100% turnout. They could be a paid-up member of the Labour Party. They could be somewhere in between. They might never have voted, and they might never vote in their lives. But whatever they said, John would come back, as colleagues in the gallery know, with a C for Conservative. Such was John's optimism that he had won them over. And the more time, that passed on that very first campaign, which was a tough campaign, not really with the Labour Party as much as with UKIP back in those days, who came forth. The more time passed on that first campaign, the more I realised John wasn't always wrong. He wasn't actually as over-optimistic as he sounded, because there were so many people who voted Labour in our ward when general elections came around, or people who didn't vote at all, who would come out to vote for John because he was John. So much so that we had to invent a new code for our canvass returns, JH, which meant someone who was not remotely a Conservative, but who was going to vote for John Hills. And the only other person we've ever had to do that for, Mr. Mayor, was GB, Jeff Brighty, Mr. Mayor. And vote they did for John in great numbers for 7 elections in a row. And they voted for John, voted JH, for good reason. John was utterly devoted to Mottingham, Cold Harbour and New Eltham. And it's one mark of his legacy that if you and I, Mr. Mayor, were to arrange to meet up at the John Hills crossing in my ward, then we would have to be more specific than that, because there are 2 John Hills crossings, one that he got put in Southwood Road and one on the A20 itself. Just 2 examples and 2 reminders of John's physical legacy and his work for the community as you walk around the ward that Cathy and I are so privileged to represent. The cane rooms at New Eltham Library, the Cold Harbour police base that he fought to keep open, the community hall where you'd find John every Tuesday supporting CTRA's coffee morning without fail, St Andrew's Church, where he and Pat were valued members of the congregation for so many years, and our local post offices that he felt particularly strongly about to make sure that older people in the community had access to services. And many more examples, and of course the homes of hundreds and thousands of people that John helped over his quarter of a century as a councillor. John couldn't help people enough. So he wasn't a politician, he was a community man, a leader, and that's how he'll be remembered. And he set the tone for politics in the south of the borough. It was John's example that we all followed. He was always so encouraging and generous with his time and his encouragement and his words. And I don't think it's a coincidence that since 2022, when we've been in this slightly awkward position, let's face it, where we've had 2 Conservative councillors and 1 Labour councillor in the ward, it's no coincidence that in our ward we've really made that work, and it was John that set that tone and set that example. Always worked together, always put the residents first and never let party politics get in the way. And I know I speak for all of the ward councillors who served with John, Mandy, Chris, Neil, Roger, Cathy and myself, when I say that all of us just feel so lucky to have had the chance to serve alongside John and to learn from the example that he set. And the second reason, Mr. Mayor, that you wouldn't necessarily think John was one of the most successful council candidates in the history of our borough is that he was just so modest and so humble. And yet he had so little to be humble about. He served his country during his national service, and we will all remember John in his impeccable uniform every Remembrance Day. He was always on show, Mr. Mayor, in the finest tradition of the British Army. He was a great champion of the Gurkhas in our community. He was the council's armed forces representative, as you said, a role that meant a lot to him and that he carried out with great care and diligence. He was, as you said, a governor of 3 schools over his time as a councillor. He was chair of the Community Association of New Eltham. And anyone who has ever walked past his and Pat's house on Arsenal Road could tell you that he probably could have won Britain in Bloom single-handedly with his display of flowers every year in his front garden. He loved his family, he loved his country, and he loved his role as a councillor for Mottingham, Cold Harbour and New Eltham, where he will be missed most terribly. And since the news, we've been absolutely inundated with memories and words and tributes from residents who John helped, from the people whose lives he touched. And one of those messages simply said, "God bless you, John." And I can't think of a better ending than that.
Thank you, Councillor Hartley, for those words. I tell you, we are all the same. We feel that exactly this is what we saw John to be. Can I ask the leader of the council if you have something to say as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've heard 2 powerful and moving tributes tonight, one from yourself and the leader of the opposition. The words spoken this evening have a common thread. They speak of a kind person who was committed to public service. And public service very much defined late Councillor John Hills. Over the past fortnight, Mr. Mayor, I've learned about John, as many of you have shared your memories with me. Stories from his years of service as a councillor and his service in the armed forces. As Councillor Hartley mentioned, John didn't seek the limelight. Just knowing he had helped a resident with their problems was enough for him. That takes great strength as a politician sometimes. John valued helping others above all else. He wasn't a tribal politician. He chose to do politics differently, but still remained a giant in the Greenwich Conservative Party. He was always impeccably dressed, always in a suit at full council. I imagine a reflection of his ever-professional approach to his role as a councillor. And I also remember he must have been shocked when he first saw me as leader not wearing a tie. But despite that, Mr. Mayor, he still gave me the respect for the mandate that I carried as leader. One year I gave Christmas cards to all councillors, and I found out afterwards that for weeks John was running around looking for me so he could return the favour. And that was the nature of him. And in bumping into me, the first thing he did was hug me and say to me, "Anthony, I never knew we were doing Christmas cards this year," and apologised. That was the kind of person that he was. Mr. Mayor, there's no better example of John's commitment to serving his residents than the anecdote that I heard last week. And for me, it really summed him up as a councillor. Often, when a resident came to him with a minor repair, rather than pass this on to our housing team, he would carry out the repair himself, quietly doing what he could within his power to help another person. That exemplifies the nature of him as a councillor. At John's funeral, it was a standing room only, a testament to the man he was and the strength of feeling that many in the community had to go and pay their respects to him. Mr. Mayor, John will be missed by all of us in this chamber this evening and residents across the borough. He was a dedicated public servant who transcended the political divide, but still remained the giant in the Greenwich Conservative Party. And on behalf of the council, Mr. Mayor, I send our thoughts, condolences, and prayers to his family and every resident that he touched. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader, for those kind words as well. Does any other member wish to say a few words? Yes. So that you've got the phone. Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm standing. Look, lots of you in here will know John far better than me, far longer than me. I've only known him a couple of years. So what I thought I'd do is tell you how he was to me when I was elected. He'd been a councillor for a really long time, and probably all of that time had been with other Tories. And so when I came along, I suspect he was a bit apprehensive about that. I don't think he knew how things were going to play out, whatever. But John was lovely to me. He was kind, he was generous, he gave me his time, he told me what meetings to go to, who I should talk to. He even offered to give me a lift quite often if I'd gone straight from work. He introduced me to people, and he was genuinely nothing but kind. Within my first week, he gave me his phone number, his mobile, and he also gave me his home number. And he said to me, Kath, if you have any problems, if anyone's not nice to you, you give me a ring and I'll come and sort them out. And he was 82. And luckily I didn't have to. But let's be honest, if I had had to, I'm absolutely certain he would have come and sorted out the problem for me. The thing that John did for me most, though, and that I will always be grateful for, is he was so encouraging. Whenever I saw him, he would say, "You're doing a good job, Kath." And it really meant a lot to me. And even once he wasn't out and about and he wasn't mobile anymore and I didn't really see him, he would ring me fairly regularly, actually, to say, you know, keep going, you're doing all right, keep going. And we all need that sometimes, for somebody just to give us a little bit of a, you're doing okay here. And to come from someone like John, it really meant a lot to me. I was really lucky to have had John as my fellow councillor. And just one small indulgence, I would like to say thank you to Councillor Hartley for keeping me in the loop over everything that happened with John and the details, and also for you know, taking our steer from John so that we could work so collaboratively together. It's a friendly place to be, and I'm grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words as well. I will move to Councillor Highland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I think we've all been moved by the tributes to John Hills this evening. So what can I say that hasn't been said by everyone else? Because I think we all agree what an amazing guy he was, what a sweet guy. Loyal to his party, but as the leader said, not tribal, apart from when he told Gordon Brown to fall under a bus when the PM visited Cold Harbour, which a few people in the Labour Party were upset about, but I think it's all forgiven now. But he retained his absolute sense of humour. Danny and I were canvassing up Arsenal Road, and John was stood in his garden with all his fingers bandaged, where he'd been leafleting and a dog had attacked his fingers. I assured him this had happened to several people on our side of the chamber, including Chris Roberts, you know, the leader at the time. But when I became leader, I had to clear up all the situation of the aftermath of the Lee Rigby tragic murder that occurred. And it reminds me that today is the 10th anniversary of the death, the murder, let's put it as it is, of Lee Rigby. And today we went to St George's Chapel and we laid wreaths with the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, and several colleagues around the room were there today to lay floral tributes. Now, the Conservative group had a lot of pressure from people like Penny Mordaunt, Boris Johnson, and so on, to put a memorial at the murder site, not what his wife or his mother or stepfather wanted. And I was basically dragged up to City Hall to explain myself to Boris. And I did, and at the end of it, he accepted the arguments that we were doing what the family wanted us to do. And that, I want to pay tribute to you all on the Conservative benches for supporting what we on the Labour side had actually done, which was to create that memorial for the 10 people who've died since the Second World War. And that includes the 2 guys who died in the pub up here when the King's Arms was blown up in 1974. And that anniversary will come up fairly soon. But John was resolute, as were the other members of this chamber in all. And I am so grateful to him for that. But when we were canvassing, Danny and I, up the street on Arsenal Road, and he had stood there with his fingers bandaged, Danny shoved a Labour poster under his sling and then took a selfie, because Danny, of course, king of the selfies. Now, I wouldn't have done this, but Danny did. He put it on Twitter. And, of course, people went nuts. And Danny quickly took it down, and John was in a spot of bother for a while. But his humour was there. And, as you say, he was sartorially elegant, generous, kind, and thoughtful. He was passionate in support of the armed forces and so proud of this council's commitment to the armed forces. I would like to also say that he was a big supporter of GLAB, Greenwich Local Labour and Business, because he personally saw that his grandson had benefited from working with GLAB and in fact then became an employee of the council. Not before he got Apprentice of the Year. And he was so proud of Mitchell and so proud of his family. And as you said, quite rightly, that it was his family that transcended his love of this council, and his wife, Pat. I shall miss his personal support and his presence here in this chamber. May his soul rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Highland, for those kind words as well. Can I ask Councillor Greenwich to also say something? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've just picked this up from the chair. John's sitting with us here. And those tributes that we have heard so far have been absolutely unbelievable. And I am just going to say a few words because I think a lot has already been said. I have only known John for the last 10 years or so, but he reminded me of my favourite uncle. Always immaculately dressed, proud of his connection with the armed forces, and a true gentleman, with sometimes a wicked sense of humour. He loved his wife, Patricia, which has already been said so many times, his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and he loved helping others. And that was why he was respected by so many. He would walk miles in the ward to visit and offer support to residents who needed it. And I know that he sometimes helped fix any problems with them that he thought he might be able to. He was also a dear friend and colleague and will be sadly missed. I have asked Patricia if I can read out a poem from his service yesterday in commemoration of all that he was and did. It is called A Successful Man by Bessie Anderson Stanley. That man is a success, who has lived well, laughed often, and loved much, who has gained the respect of intelligent men and the love of children, who has filled his niche and accomplished his task, who leaves the world better than he found it, who has never lacked appreciation of earth's beauty or failed to express it, who looked for the best in others and gave the best he had. That man is a success. God bless you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Greenwell, for those kind words as well. I will ask Councillor Gardner. You want to also say?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. John Hills, the late John Hills, was elected to the council, Mr. Mayor, in 2000, as was said by Councillor Hartley, and I joined this council in 2002, which actually, for the first time, makes me not the oldest, but the the person that's been here the earliest of any member here tonight. And I first really got to know John when I was cabinet member in 2003-2004 for property and modernisation. And the post office wanted to make some closures. There were big post office closures. And there were a few in the borough. One I remember is near where I live in Charlton Village. That was closed. And there were a few that we campaigned very hard to keep. And this was all part of our modernisation strategy at the time. And John, with Clive Efford MP, fought a very vigorous campaign to keep the Cold Harbour post office open. I went down there a few times. We had a petition. And we went to meet the minister, a Labour minister at the time. Anyway, we eventually persuaded, by giving them the business of being able to collect the rents, which helped their commercial model, we persuaded the post office that were determined to close all these branches to keep Cold Harbour post office open, which is very important for that little group of shops on the Cold Harbour estate. And it still is open to this day. And that, I think, is a great tribute to John Hills, who always stood up for his community, and I was very pleased to support that. It was the only successful saving in the borough. John, Mr. Mayor, never sought personal advancement or glory. He was never a councillor for the money. He only sought to serve his constituents and be a dedicated public service. And that, I believe, is a standard, whatever our politics, that we should all aspire to. We probably have very different political values and political attitudes, but we shared a passion to be effective ward champions and really stand up for our local communities. I draw the line personally, though, at going in and doing people's repairs for them. And I think that came through to me most recently when I chaired the Highways Committee the last 2 years, and John did, till he was very ill, come along to the meetings. And he always made very intelligent and informed contributions and always asked questions and made sensible suggestions. He didn't come in through ideology. He came in to try and get the best result possible for the people of the borough. And that, I think, was the man that John was, and we shall miss him.
Thank you, Councillor Gardner. We also have Councillor Fletcher, who wants to say some few words.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I first got to know John many, many years ago when I was a council officer. I had black hair then. And we used to carry out numerous estate inspections in Eltham, and John was always there. And no matter the condition that the complaints were about, John was always a perfect gentleman and used to come up to and say it was, can you and your lads get that sorted? And we did. And when John used to phone the office, the supervisor used to say, Councillor Hills has been on the phone, Leo. Can we go do it while we've got a minute? And that was the measure of the man. And then when I was privileged to be sitting in the chair you were sitting in, I judged Greenwich in Bloom for 2 years running. And John and Pat won it for 2 years running. Apparently they won it every year. But when you saw their garden, you know why they won it every year. And a few months after that, I invited John and Pat to the Mayor's Parlour for afternoon tea, and we had a fantastic afternoon. And as I was leaving, John said something to me. I'm not going to tell you what John said, because it's not fair, but it brought a tear to my eye. What he said to me was the kindest thing that anyone had ever said to me. Now, as you know, I'm a bit of a cockney, and I grew up on a council estate and still on it. So, although he was a gentleman, in my terminology, he was a diamond geezer.
Thank you. Thank you all for all your contributions and your submissions about how well John lived his life and played his politics. We also have with us tonight former colleagues of John who wish to speak. Could you please step forward to the microphone? I think I'll call, Spencer is not here, I'll call Naja. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, for giving this has been an opportunity to add my own tributes to the lovely words that have been said already this evening. I'd also like to thank you very much indeed for finding the time to attend John's funeral yesterday alongside other members from across the Chamber. It was only fitting that there was such a large turnout, as has already been mentioned, from John's many friends and colleagues. But the fact that it was led by you as the first citizen of the borough was, I think, very much appreciated by John's family. Amongst those who joined us yesterday were some of the many former Conservative colleagues who served alongside John in this chamber. And in speaking tonight, myself and former Councillor Davis do so as representatives of those many former colleagues who share with us a sense of very personal loss. We have the privilege of working alongside an exemplary public servant, but more than that, a wonderful friend and colleague. John was a constant presence, a constant reassuring presence throughout my time in Greenwich politics. He was here before I was elected, and he was here after I left the stage. As I navigated my way through the politics of this chamber and outside, he was always wonderfully supportive. And as has just been said, he was an extremely kind man. It's a virtue that is often underappreciated. But he would often call me up with words of encouragement, or just break out into a broad smile, and as we heard from Councillor Hartley, that famous gesture of just a very emphatic thumbs up. Coming from him, it really did mean a lot. As many of us can testify, it's not always an easy job, particularly when you're leading your group. And those small gestures and words of appreciation and encouragement really help you to get through. That's what I got from John Hills. One conversation that I particularly remember was actually at the last election, as we sat in the office stuffing envelopes, as you do, and he started to reminisce about his service for our country in the armed forces. Now, we all knew his commitment to veterans and to the military in this borough, but he rarely made it about himself. Hearing some of his stories was therefore a rare privilege indeed, and one that I will always remember. Because, of course, when it came to public commemorations, Remembrance Day, Armed Forces Day every year, He was without fail, as we've heard, on parade. And as the opposition group, I think we were all extremely proud and considered it a real honour that we had amongst ourselves someone with his credentials with the armed forces. He worked away extremely diligently on those issues behind the scenes, including as the lead petitioner on an online petition to save Woolwich Barracks. Thousands of people signed the petition, and for a time, John became an unlikely viral sensation on the internet as the petition was shared far and wide. And I remember calling him up to update him on the latest figures. It went up to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And he was extremely proud, and rightly so. As Councillor Hartley so eloquently put it, John was not a politician in the ordinary sense. He had no interest in the grandstanding and debating society antics that some of us regularly enjoyed in this place over the years. He just got on with the job of working hard for his community and getting results for the residents who elected him time and time again. A litany of small wins that never got headlines but meant so much to so many people. Public service and the business of politics are often unfairly maligned as self-serving or somehow disreputable. And in this chamber, the task of being an opposition councillor can often be dismissed as a pointless or irrelevant occupation. Don't I know it? But behind the noise of those party political battles and the harsh words that are spoken, there are those who, like John, stay largely silent, but whose achievements speak volumes. If you want to know his legacy, I'd urge you, get out there on the Cold Harbour estate and speak to residents. In fact, I know quite a few of you will be doing so in the coming weeks. Well, you can come and join you. They'll hear on doorstep after doorstep the affection and respect of the people that John served, and whose lives he devoted his own life to serving, from his first days as a councillor to his very last days. You'll hear the quiet gratitude of tenants in need of help and residents in need of a champion who found one in John. Too often in politics, we count success only in terms of votes won and seats gained. And for Greenwich Conservatives, that judgment has often been a harsh one. But it's not the only or the most important one. As Councillor Greenwell alluded to when she quoted the words of the extremely moving poem with which John's funeral concluded, a successful man, there are some people who, whatever their politics, make a success of their lives by enriching the lives of others. John Hills was such a man. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
For the newcomers, Nigel Fletcher was one of our colleagues here and the deputy opposition leader in these chambers. So thank you for your kind words as well. I will ask Charlie Davis, another colleague of us from the opposition side who was with us here, who was very vibrant. Please, we want to hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've already heard so many beautiful tributes to John this evening. I know how much this will mean to his family and everyone who knew John. John was held in high regard by everyone who met him, something you can see from the genuine warmth that has exuded this evening from all sides of the chamber. And I know how touched John was by the kind words in this chamber said about him last year. And that's because everyone recognised his unique style as a councillor. He was at times completely apolitical, as we've heard, and John would do whatever it took to get results for residents, and inevitably delivering them. And as we've heard tonight, quite literally by doing it himself. I said when John's sad passing was announced that you couldn't go 5 minutes in his ward without meeting someone John had helped, and that's true. Everyone has either been helped by John or knows someone who's been helped by John. And over the last few weeks, I've been stopped by countless residents who've wanted to pass on condolences on John's passing. On a personal note, John was a constant source of support and encouragement. The phone call to see how you were doing, the text telling you you had done a great job and that you always had his support, and the pat on the back and a thumbs up after you'd given a speech in the council chamber. To John, it didn't matter if the speech was any good or not. You'd stood up to be counted. As we've heard tonight, John was elected as a councillor in a by-election in January 2000, which was after the passing of my grandpa, who was a councillor in New Elton Ward. And the biggest tribute I can pay John is that I know how proud he would have been by the councillor who followed him, a giant of the community who always put residents first. I will truly miss John, an exceptional councillor, colleague and friend, and all my thoughts are with John's family at this incredibly difficult time.
Thank you, Charlie, for those kind words as well. We move swiftly. Everyone now stand for a minute of silence in remembrance of Councillor Hills and also in remembrance of Thank you. May their gentle souls rest in peace.